Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something pretty universal, really. Suffering, perseverance, and, well, where we find meaning in the midst of it all. We're going to explore this, but strictly through the lens of the sources we've got in front of us, mostly biblical excerpts, Psalms, Job, Proverbs, and some analysis tied to them. Our goal is just to unpack what these specific texts have to say.
That's right. We're really focusing in. The perspective here is grounded entirely within these biblical sources, offering a framework built around a relationship with God.
Absolutely. And, the first thing that just jumps out from these texts is how blunt they are about suffering. No sugarcoating.
Not at all. They use some incredibly intense language.
Yeah.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
The sources make it crystal clear that suffering is shown as, well, real, deep, often devastating. They detail the types of pain. Think about Job, which features heavily here. Suffering is described as like extreme sorrow and disaster.
Wow.
Yeah, so heavy. It's compared to being heavier than sea sand.
Heavier than sand. That's a powerful image.
It is. It conveys this crushing weight. Job also mentions pain and distress so bad someone's unable to lift one's head. It's physical and mental.
Right, that total inability to even look up. And what about the Psalms? How do they fit into this picture?
The songs are just as raw, maybe even more personal sometimes. The sources pull out these moments of feeling totally abandoned by God.
Abandoned.
Yeah, like God is hiding his face,
Yeah.
leaving you with daily sorrow, watching your enemies just win.
Oof. That hits on the spiritual side of things, the isolation.
Exactly. And there's more. Psalm 38, cited in our sources, talks about physical and mental pain tied to sin or God's anger, leaving you bent over, just mourning all day long.
And over mourning.
And then there's the sheer misery of having tears as daily food while people mock you, asking, where is your God?
Oh, that question. Adding doubt and shame right on top of the pain.
It must, right? According to these texts, yeah. Other parts describe feeling like you're drowning, sinking in deep mire, floods overwhelming.
Just completely submerged.
Crying out until your throat is dry, your eyes fail from watching or weeping. And that image of eating ashes like bread, mixing your drink with tears.
It paints a picture of utter desolation, like grief contaminates everything.
It does. And Psalm 143 talks about being hunted down, life crushed to the ground, living in darkness like the long dead.
Like the dead.
And Proverbs kind of sums up the internal effect.
Yeah.
Sorrow leads to a crushed spirit.
Okay, so takeaway number one seems really clear. These biblical sources are brutally realistic about pain. They don't offer easy answers or pretend it isn't awful. They stare it right in the face.
That honesty is definitely the starting point presented here. They validate that deep suffering is real.
But then here's the turn, right? This is where it gets interesting. They're honest about the pain, but then they suggest that this very suffering, it can actually be a catalyst for spiritual transformation.
Exactly. That's a major pivot in the material we're looking at. They actually describe how this can happen.
What are the mechanisms?
Well, one big one is how suffering can lead to a deeper engagement with God's word, like learning from it. The sources point heavily to Psalm 119, saying suffering can be, believe it or not, beneficial because it teaches God's statutes.
Beneficial how?
They quote Psalm 119, verse 67, "Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep your word."
Ah, okay. So the suffering itself isn't good, but the result, turning back to God's guidance, can be like a painful course correction.
That's the dynamic presented, yes.
Yeah.
A tough lesson, maybe, that stops you from wandering and makes you really pay attention to God's word, which these texts say provides life lessons and value.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Another thing is that suffering often just drives people to God and makes them cry out for help. And the sources really emphasize God's response here. They say he does not despise or detest the affliction of the afflicted. Crucially, he hears when they cry out.
So the act of crying out in pain isn't met with silence, according to these texts. God pays attention.
That's the message, yes. Experiencing God listening, maybe even providing some kind of rescue or salvation and healing, is said to really strengthen that connection with him. This sort of proves the relationship is real, and that brings hope.
Right. Feeling heard in your lowest moment would be powerful.
Definitely. And there's one more related point. The intense need you feel in suffering. It can actually deepen your desire for God himself.
Deepen the desire. How's that described?
They use that really striking image from Psalm 42. As the deer pants for the water brooks, so my soul pants for you, O God, for the living God.
Ah, that deep thirst. Not just a casual wish, but a real urgent need.
Exactly. especially when, other supports might feel like they've fallen away. This search for God himself is presented as a fundamental quest, made more intense by hardship. Seeking God's face becomes a vital direction.
So suffering, while awful, is presented here as having the surprising potential. It can correct your path, drive you to seek God's help, make you experience his attention, and even intensify your longing for him.
It's framed as a kind of tough teacher, yeah, pushing you towards God and his guidance.
Okay, so if suffering can be this catalyst, what about the person going through it? Let's talk about perseverance. The sources say it's not just gritting your teeth, right? It's active.
That's a really key distinction they make. Perseverance, in this biblical view, isn't passive endurance. It's about active choices, deliberate actions in the midst of the difficulty.
Okay, like what kind of actions?
Well, a central one is steadfast trust. This means actively choosing to trust God, deliberately taking refuge in him.
Taking refuge.
Yeah.
Like finding shelter.
Exactly. And consciously committing your spirit, your life, into his hands. It's about cultivating a steadfast heart, one that tries to remain unafraid even when things are shaky. The sources say this trust is a solid anchor for hope.
So it's an active anchoring, not just being tossed around. What else?
Another really important active element is holding fast to God's word, consciously clinging to his teachings, his commands, making sure your steps hold fast to his paths.
So it's about alignment, actively trying to live by that guidance, especially when it's tough.
Precisely. Not forgetting his law, even when, as one psalm says, your life is in constant danger, loving and keeping his testimonies. And there's that powerful line from Proverbs, hold fast to instruction because it is your life.
It is your life. Wow. That frames it as essential, not optional.
It does. It links adherence to God's word directly to navigating life itself. The word is also called a lamp and a light guidance when it's dark.
Okay, so trust and actively following God's guidance. Any other parts to this active perseverance?
Yes, maintaining integrity is mentioned, committing to act rightly, justly, even when there's pressure or opposition.
Sticking to your principles even when it costs you.
That seems to be the idea. And finally, there's patiently waiting. But even this waiting isn't just passive idleness. It's described as actively enduring, waiting for God's action when you can't see a solution yourself. It's waiting with faith.
Okay, so this picture of perseverance is much more dynamic than just toughing it out. It's about actively rooting yourself in trust, in God's word, in integrity, and holding on with faith, even while waiting.
That active faith-based response is definitely central to how these texts describe perseverance.
Right. Which brings us to the big question, really. How does all this, the suffering, the perseverance, connect to meaning? According to these sources, where does meaning ultimately come from?
They're very clear on this point. Meaning isn't primarily found just out there in the world or in your circumstances or even just in overcoming suffering. According to these sources, meaning, value, purpose, it's all described as being firmly rooted in the connection and relationship with the divine, specifically God.
So the relationship itself is the source of meaning, not something you achieve, but something you're in.
That's the core idea presented, yes. It's foundational. And this meaning, rooted in that relationship, isn't just a static thing you possess. The sources describe it as something that's actively realized and expressed. It's found and lived out through certain activities within that relationship.
Okay, so the relationship is the source, and certain actions are how you access or live out that meaning.
Kind of, yeah. These activities aren't the source themselves, but they're the ways the meaning from the relationship is demonstrated, deepened, and expressed in life.
Got it. So what are these activities? What does that look like in practice, according to the sources?
Well, the first and maybe most fundamental one is seeking God himself. Not just seeking things from God, but seeking God's presence. That deep soul-level thirst and longing we mentioned from Psalm 42.
The deer panting for water.
Exactly. Constantly seeking God's face. The sources frame this pursuit as the core aspiration, the real basis for meaning, something that goes beyond whatever circumstances you're in.
So the act of seeking God is the primary way to engage with meaning.
It's presented as the foundational direction, yes. Then, closely related is obeying God's laws. His word laws, statutes, commands is described as perfect, a source of wisdom, joy, light. It gives direction and guidance. Remember the lamp and light.
Right.
Learning and obeying brings life lessons and value. We saw how suffering can teach this. And holding fast to instruction is your life. So obedience isn't just rule following. It's presented as a pathway to finding direction and value within that relationship.
Living by God's guidance is living meaningfully.
Okay, what else? Worshiping, praising, thanking God. These are highlighted as really important actions, expressions of meaning. Things like singing praises regularly, praising God in the community, in the assembly, singing as long as you live, thanking God for his kindness. These are seen as central acts of a meaningful life lived with God.
So orienting yourself towards God through worship and thanks.
Yes, and then there's something very practical, acting justly and showing mercy.
How does that connect to meaning?
It's described as embodying life's value. It's about reflecting God's own character, his justice, his mercy in your actions. So it's not just a good deed, it's living out the meaning found in relating to a just and merciful God.
Making the meaning tangible through action.
Exactly. And they get specific. Defending the weak, the fatherless, the afflicted, the needy, the sojourner, the widow. Rescuing them is explicitly called meaningful. Even showing mercy to enemies, giving them food and water, is presented as something God approves of.
So compassion and justice, especially for the vulnerable, are key expressions of this relationship-based meaning.
A very concrete manifestation, yes, aligning your actions with God's character. Then there's trusting God's salvation and providence. Placing your hope and faith in God is called a solid foundation, something that brings blessing, prevents shame. Recognizing God's presence everywhere, his guiding hand, like in Psalm 139, is said to provide comfort and meaning no matter what you're facing, even in the worst difficulties.
Knowing you're not alone, that provides meaning.
That awareness provides hope and prevents isolation, which contributes significantly to meaning. Yes. And finally, circling back to something we discussed earlier, experiencing God's response in suffering.
How does that fit in here with meaning?
Well, the sources reiterate that when you turn to God in your distress and you experience him actually paying attention, hearing you, maybe intervening somehow, that experience itself validates the relationship. It confirms it's real and responsive, even in pain. And that confirmation, that validation, brings profound hope and meaning.
The reality of the connection proven in hardships is itself meaningful.
Exactly.
Okay, so if we try to tie this all together, the reality of suffering, its potential as a catalyst, the active choices of perseverance, and this idea of meaning rooted in relationship with God. How do these sources suggest it all fit?
Well, it seems the perspective presented is that suffering itself isn't the point, and neither is perseverance just an end goal. Instead, experiencing suffering and actively choosing to persevere through trust, obedience, seeking God. These become the context, the pathway within that fundamental relationship with God where meaning is found, clarified, deepened, and really lived out.
So it's dynamic. It's in the struggle, approach faithfully, that the meaning rooted in God becomes clearer.
That's what these sources seem to suggest. Faithfulness and reliance during difficulty actually reinforce and express the meaning that's already fundamentally there in God himself. And that meaning expresses itself through seeking him, obeying him, worshiping him, and acting with justice and mercy.
Wow. This is quite a deep dive, unpacking these biblical perspectives. We've gone from the raw pain of suffering to its, well, unexpected potential, the active nature of perseverance, and finally landing on meaning being deeply relational.
Yeah, summarizing from these sources, they're incredibly honest about suffering's reality, but they show its potential as a catalyst for drawing closer to God. Perseverance isn't passive. It's an active, faith-filled response, trusting, obeying, holding on to integrity. And ultimately, meaning isn't found despite challenges, but is rooted in the relationship with God, lived out by seeking him, following his guidance, worshiping him, trusting his care, and reflecting his character, especially towards those in need.
And thinking about that perspective meaning found in relationship with God, lived out actively even when things are hard. It leaves us with a question for you, the listener. Given this view from the texts, how might actively pursuing that relationship in the ways described here change how you approach life's challenges, big or small?
Something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the sources.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.